Welcome to the All Sorts podcast. You know, your guide to navigating the world of news and information.
And we're so glad you're here with us today, ready to sort through it all.
We believe that understanding the world shouldn't be a chore.
No, it should be an adventure, a journey.
Exactly. So hit that like button, share this deep dive with your friends and family, anyone who loves to learn, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more deep dives like this.
And don't forget to check out our past episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
We've got a whole library of deep dives waiting for you.
And for even more, all sorts goodness, find us on X, Instagram, and Threads.
All right, so today we're diving into some really important reports.
Yes, we have articles from AP News, Al Jazeera, and Reuters, all focusing on the escalating conflict between Israel and Palestine.
And specifically, the killing of a Hamas spokesman in Gaza and the bombings in Syria.
That's right. It's been a turbulent week in the region, and we're here to break it all down for you.
So let's start with Syria, where things seem to have escalated quite rapidly.
Yeah, absolutely. On Tuesday, March 25th, Israel carried out an airstrike in southwestern Syria.
And what was the reported death toll from this?
Well, AP News reported at least 6 fatalities, but the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights suggested it could be as high as 7.
They're usually pretty reliable, aren't they? With their sources on the ground and all that.
Yes, they are. They have a network of people in Syria who monitor and report on conflict events.
So it sounds like this strike had a significant impact, and it's no surprise that Syria had a strong reaction to it.
Right. Syria's foreign ministry issued a statement condemning the strike, calling it a violation of their sovereignty and international law.
And they also claimed that all the victims were civilians.
That's what they stated, yes. But as is often the case in these situations, Israel has a different perspective on what happened.
So what did Israel say about the strike?
Well, according to an Israeli military spokesperson, their troops were actually fired upon first by gunmen.
Oh, so they're saying it was in retaliation.
Exactly, and that they then launched a drone strike in response.
So we have two very different accounts of how things unfolded there.
Yes, conflicting narratives are sadly a common feature of this conflict.
Now, beyond the fatalities, were there any other reports of damage or injuries in that area?
Yes. Sana, the Syrian state news agency, reported that several people were wounded, including one woman.
And they also mentioned something about Israeli tanks firing in a village called Korea, right?
That's right. And what's interesting is that both the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights and a local resident confirmed that there were clashes between Israeli troops and residents after Israeli forces tried to enter that village.
Wow, so things really escalated quickly there with civilians taking up arms against the Israeli troops.
It seems so, and it just further highlights the volatility of the situation there. The reports also mentioned that residents of Korea started fleeing their homes because of the shelling.
Seeking refuge in nearby villages and even olive groves.
Exactly. It really underscores the human cost of this conflict and the fear that these people are living with every day.
Now, this border region between Syria and Israel has always been a bit of a flashpoint, hasn't it?
It has, and there's a complex history there. The AP News report mentions Israel's control of a UN-patrolled buffer zone.
Right, and they say Israel seized this zone after Islamist insurgents overthrew President Assad.
Well, actually, that's where we need to point out a discrepancy in the reporting, because other sources indicate that Assad is still in power.
Oh, so there's some conflicting information about the timeline and who's actually in control in Syria.
Yes, and that just goes to show how difficult it can be to get a clear and accurate picture of what's happening in these conflict zones.
Absolutely. So we have to be very careful about what we take as fact.
Absolutely. Critical evaluation of sources is paramount.
So despite the conflicting information about Assad, what does Israel say about their presence in that buffer zone?
They claim they're there to prevent threats and to protect the Druze minority who live in that region.
Ah, the Druze community, they've always been kind of caught in the middle of this conflict, haven't they?
Sadly, they have. But what do Syria and the UN have to say about all of this?
That's a good question, because I imagine they have a different view on Israel's presence there.
They do. Both Syrian authorities and UN officials say that Israel is violating the 1974 agreement that established the buffer zone.
So they want them out.
They want Israel to withdraw completely. They see it as a violation of Syrian territory.
Interesting. So we have this ongoing dispute over the buffer zone, and then we also have these reports of internal strife within Syria itself.
Right. There's an investigation into some really troubling reports of clashes and revenge attacks in the coastal region of Syria.
And who's involved in these attacks?
Well, it seems to be pro-Assad loyalists targeting the Alawite community.
Wow. So even within Syria, there are these deep divisions and ongoing violence.
Well, sadly, that's the case, and it's reportedly led to a significant number of civilian deaths.
Just adding to the tragedy of this whole situation.
Absolutely. And a spokesperson for the investigative committee, Yasser Al-Farhan, said they've taken almost 100 testimonies so far.
Wow. But I imagine it's difficult to get people to talk in such a dangerous environment.
It is Al-Farhan mentioned that some witnesses are too afraid to come forward because of the risks involved.
That's understandable, but it also makes it much harder to get to the bottom of what's happening.
It does, and this internal conflict is also having a broader impact on Syria's international standing.
How so?
Well, the AP News report says that this violence is a setback for Damascus's efforts to improve its image and get those long-standing economic sanctions lifted.
So it's making it even harder for them to rebuild and recover after years of conflict.
Exactly. And on top of all of that, there were also reports of infrastructure problems in Syria on that same day.
Right. I remember reading about some kind of internet outage.
Yes, Sana reported that internet cables were cut, which they believe was a deliberate act of sabotage.
So this was on top of the airstrike and the internal clashes.
It was a very chaotic day in Syria.
Yeah.
And this internet outage affected a large part of the country for about 12 hours.
Wow. Talk about adding insult to injury.
It really highlights the fragility of essential services in a conflict zone.
And speaking of fragile, there was another incident that same day that we haven't even touched on yet.
You're talking about the earlier shelling in southern Syria.
Yes, that's right. I remember reading that local authorities reported 5 people were killed in that attack.
And the Israeli military confirmed that they struck Syria in response to what they called incoming fire from terrorists.
So essentially they're claiming this was another act of retaliation?
That's their statement.
Yeah.
Yes. So within just one 24-hour period, we saw multiple incidents of violence and escalating tensions involving Israel and Syria.
A very worrying trend indeed, and sadly, the situation in Gaza isn't much better.
No, it's not. Let's move on to that now, shall we?
Yes, please, because the reports out of Gaza are equally concerning, particularly the killing of a Hamas spokesman.
Right. Al Jazeera reported that on March 27th, Israeli forces bombed a tent in northern Jabalia.
And that's where the Hamas spokesman was killed.
Yes, Abdelatif al-Qanua was killed in that strike, and several others were reportedly wounded.
And this was an overnight attack.
That's what Al Jazeera reported. And it wasn't the only bombardment that took place in Gaza that night.
Right. The article mentioned 19 other Palestinians killed in separate attacks.
Yes, sadly, it seems that Israel intensified its military operations across Gaza that night.
And this comes after a period of relative calm earlier this year, doesn't it?
It does. There was a ceasefire in place that started back in January.
That's according to the Reuters report.
Yes. Reuters says that there was a nearly 2-month truce, but it ended abruptly on March 18th.
With those devastating airstrikes that killed over 400 people in Gaza.
Yes, a tragic escalation that brought a swift end to that fragile peace.
So what led to the breakdown of the ceasefire? Was it a specific incident or just a gradual erosion of trust?
Well, both sides blame each other for violating the terms of the truce.
So more conflicting narratives.
Unfortunately, yes. But on March 18th, Netanyahu gave a statement saying that he ordered the strikes because Hamas had rejected proposals to extend the ceasefire.
And he also blamed Hamas for any civilian casualties.
That's right. He said that Hamas was using civilians as human shields, and that Israel would continue to act with increasing force.
And he also said something about negotiations only taking place under fire, right?
Yes. A rather chilling statement that suggests a prolonged conflict.
It's all just so heartbreaking, especially when you read the eyewitness accounts from that night.
Yes, the Reuters report quotes a woman named Rabiha Jamal from Gaza City who described it as hell.
And she said it felt like the war was starting all over again.
It must have been absolutely terrifying. The strikes reportedly hit houses and even tent encampments where people were taking shelter.
And on top of that, this Israeli military issued evacuation orders in parts of Gaza.
So even more people were forced to flee their homes and seek safety elsewhere.
It's hard to imagine the fear and desperation these people must be feeling.
Absolutely, and the international community has been very vocal in its condemnation of this renewed violence.
Who specifically has condemned Israel's actions?
Egypt, Qatar, and the European Union have all criticized the assault.
And the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator, Tom Fletcher, said something about the modest gains of the ceasefire being destroyed.
Yes, he expressed deep concern that a progress made during the truce had been completely wiped out.
And it doesn't help that Israel had halted aid deliveries into Gaza for weeks prior to the airstrikes.
That's right. Reuters reported that aid had been blocked for over 2 weeks, which would have only worsened the already dire humanitarian situation in Gaza.
But despite this widespread condemnation, the U.S. seems to be standing by Israel.
That's right. The U.S. acting ambassador to the UN, Dorothy Shea, said that the blame for the renewed violence lies solely with Hamas.
And she also said that the U.S. supports Israel's actions.
Yes, which puts them at odds with many other countries in the international community.
And the White House National Security Council spokesman Brian Hughes also weighed in.
He suggested that Hamas could have prevented this escalation if they had released the hostages they're holding.
Ah, yes, the hostage situation. That's been a major sticking point in the negotiations, hasn't it?
It has, and it's a very complex and sensitive issue.
But going back to that night of the airstrikes, the casualties were just horrific, weren't they?
They were, the Reuters report talked about bodies being stacked up in hospitals, many of them children.
It's just unimaginable the grief and suffering these families must be going through.
And Hamas also claimed that several of their officials were killed in those airstrikes.
Who did they name specifically?
They mentioned Essam Adaliz, Ahmed al-Heda, and Mahmoud Abu Watfa.
And all of this is happening against the backdrop of other Israeli military operations in the region, right?
Yes. Reuters also mentioned ongoing operations in the West Bank and strikes in Lebanon and Syria around the same time.
So it's not just Gaza that's bearing the brunt of this conflict.
No, it's a much wider issue with multiple fronts and interconnected events.
And what was the crux of the truce negotiations? What were the main sticking points?
Well, Israel was pushing for the release of all the hostages in exchange for a truce that would last through Ramadan and Passover.
And what was Hamas's position on that?
They said they were committed to the original ceasefire agreement, but accused Israel of refusing to discuss the second phase of the deal.
Which presumably involves some kind of concessions from Israel.
It would seem so. And they also accused Israel of suspending the entry of aid into Gaza.
So both sides blaming each other for the breakdown of the talks.
Sadly, yes, a familiar pattern in this conflict.
But amidst all of this, there have been some interesting developments within Gaza itself.
Yes, you're talking about the protests, right?
Exactly. There was a report of hundreds of Palestinians protesting against Hamas.
That's right. Primarily men chanting slogans like Hamas out and Hamas terrorists.
Wow, that's quite a bold statement considering Hamas's control over Gaza.
It is, and it could suggest growing discontent with Hamas's leadership and their handling of the conflict.
And these protesters were calling for an end to the war.
That's what the report said. It seems there's a growing weariness with the violence and the toll it's taking on the people of Gaza.
It's understandable they've been living under siege for years now.
And this latest escalation has only made things worse.
Now, another issue that's been in the headlines is the targeting of journalists covering this conflict.
Sadly, yes. Israel claimed to have killed an Al Jazeera journalist, Hossam Shabbat, on Monday, March 24th.
And what was their justification for that?
They accused him of being a Hamas sniper terrorist, but Al Jazeera strongly denies this.
Of course they do. And this incident has sparked outrage among Palestinian journalists.
Rightfully so. They're protesting and calling for an end to the targeting of reporters.
It's a dangerous job covering conflict zones, and journalists should be protected, not targeted.
Absolutely. Freedom of the press is essential, especially in times of war.
Now, on a somewhat more positive note, there was an update regarding a Palestinian filmmaker who had been detained.
You're talking about Hamdan Bilal, the Oscar-winning film.
Yes, he was released on Tuesday, March 25th, after being detained the day before.
It seems he was attacked by settlers in the West Bank and then held by Israeli authorities.
And he's spoken out about the conditions of his detention, hasn't he?
Yes, he described them as very difficult, and he also detailed the physical assault he suffered at the hands of the settlers.
A very disturbing account, and a reminder of the tensions and violence that permeate this conflict.
Absolutely, and as if all of this wasn't bad enough, the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza has released an updated casualty count.
And it's not good news, is it?
No, it's not. They're reporting that 792 people have been killed and over 1,600 injured in Gaza since Israel resumed its strikes.
Bringing the total death toll since October 7th, 2023 to a staggering 50,144.
Yes, a truly horrific figure that underscores the immense human cost of this conflict.
And even within Israel, there seems to be some growing concern about the hostage situation.
Yes, Israeli President Isaac Herzog expressed his shock that the issue of the hostages was no longer a top priority.
Perhaps a sign that public opinion is starting to shift.
It's possible, but only time will tell.
And despite all the calls for de-escalation, it seems the military activity in Syria continued after that initial strike.
Yes, the Israeli army struck 2 military bases in central Syria on Tuesday, March 25th.
And this was despite a warning from the EU against further escalation.
That's right. The EU foreign policy chief said that these strikes risk further inflaming the situation.
And they also said that they were unnecessary because Syria isn't currently attacking Israel.
Yes, they argued that there was no immediate threat from Syria.
So it seems there are differing opinions on the necessity of these strikes.
As always in this complex conflict.
But amidst all this violence, there have been some diplomatic efforts, haven't there?
Yes, there was a report of a phone call between the president of the UAE and Donald Trump to discuss a potential ceasefire in Gaza.
So some behind-the-scenes diplomacy going on?
It seems so, but it remains to be seen whether it will bear any fruit.
And what about Israel's stance on future actions? Have they given any indication of what they plan to do next?
Well, the Israeli defense minister issued a pretty stark warning to Hamas on March 25th.
What did he say?
He said that if the hostages aren't released, Israel will take control of territory in Gaza and continue to neutralize Hamas operatives until the group is defeated.
Wow, that sounds like a recipe for further escalation and bloodshed.
It does, and it doesn't bode well for any hopes of a peaceful resolution in the near future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the latest developments in the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's clear that the situation is extremely volatile.
And complex with no easy solutions in sight.
We've seen bombings in Syria, the killing of a Hamas spokesman in Gaza mass displacement, and a humanitarian crisis unfolding.
And while there have been some attempts at diplomacy, it seems that both sides are digging in their heels.
It's a tragedy for all involved and a stark reminder of the human cost of this seemingly intractable conflict.
What do you think, our listeners? What are your thoughts on this situation? What do you see as the biggest obstacles to peace in this region?
And what role, if any, can the international community play in helping to achieve a lasting solution?
We'd love to hear your perspectives on this, so feel free to leave a comment below.
And if you found this deep dive informative and insightful, please hit that like button.
And share it with anyone who might be interested in learning more about this complex issue.
And don't forget to subscribe to All Sorts Podcasts on YouTube for more deep dives like this.
And be sure to check out our past episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.
We've got a whole library of deep dives covering a wide range of topics.
And for even more All Sorts fun, follow us on X, Instagram, and Threads.
That's All Sorts Podcast across all platforms.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
And until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.